Chairman, Senator Feinstein, will have her statement, and then we'll go to the introduction of each of you, and then take your testimony and Q&A. The emergence of fentanyl as a significant contributor to the opioid crisis has skyrocketed in prominence over the past few years. The National Institute of Drug Abuse estimates that the drug contributes to opioid overdose deaths 46% of the time in 2016. Last year, 60% involved fentanyl. That number has increased from only 14% just 8 years ago. Between 2014 and 2016, fentanyl-related overdose deaths increased nearly 600%. It is now involved in more deaths than prescription opioid or heroin. In Congress, we're looking at all the ways that we can fight the opioid epidemic. Just last week, the House passed H.R. 6, a massive bill aimed at addressing opioid crisis, which includes a number of bills that I shepherded through the Judiciary Committee. We're hopeful that the full Senate can vote on the bill soon and get it to the President's desk. As we look for more ways to combat this crisis, we know that stopping the supply of illegal fentanyl from overseas is a critical, important piece of the puzzle. As we all know, and as I anticipate the witnesses will tell us again today, China is the #1 problem when it comes to the illegal fentanyl coming into the United States. Big labs and sophisticated amateur chemists, all alike, are more easily creating supplies to ship over to the United States and doing it typically through our mail system. According to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, quote, chemical flows from China have helped fuel a fentanyl crisis in the United States, with significant increases in U.S. opioid overdoses, deaths, and addiction rates occurring over the last several years, end of quote. Both our Drug Enforcement Administration and the State Department cite China as the primary source of fentanyl supply and its underlying chemical substances, abuse substances, and precursors. Customers can purchase fentanyl products from the Chinese laboratories online through express consignment or direct mail. Chinese exporters ship directly to individuals in the United States or to drug cartels in Mexico, who then funnel illegal fentanyl over the southern border. The new economic model for these drug traffickers pose a unique problem, never seen before. In other words, massive drug rings have been replaced by sole proprietors. A single individual with a computer, P.O. box, and a pill press can order fentanyl directly from China to his or her home. For the cost of a few $1,000s of raw product, the sole proprietor can turn that raw fentanyl into thousands of pills worth literally millions of dollars on the street. Making the problem even worse, dealers are using fentanyl as a cutting agent for other drugs, adding to their potency. Mexican cartels are mixing small quantities of fentanyl into black tar heroin and cocaine as both an addictive enhancement and a cost-cutting measure. Fentanyl production also highlights a fundamental transformation in the conventional supply side of narco trafficking. Unlike cocaine, which is pressed from the cocoa plant in the Colombian hillsides, or heroin, which is cultivated in the poppy fields of rural Afghanistan, fentanyl is not an agriculture product and therefore does not carry the associated time and logistics costs of those other drugs. Fentanyl is produced at small mom and pop shops and large and even larger pharmaceutical labs located in China. So put simply, this lethal drug is masked in the legitimate streams of pharmaceutical commerce. China is the world's largest manufacturer and top exporter of pharmaceutical ingredients, and it's estimated 160,000 chemical companies operating both legally and illegally are incentivized to produce and export fentanyl because of the lack of controlled substance laws on the books. While China has made significant progress to increase law enforcement cooperation, diplomatic engagement, and drug scheduling, more must be done. So to that end, passing the bill that I co-sponsored with our co-chairman, Senator Feinstein, and we call it the Stop the Importation and Trafficking of Synthetic Analogs Act of 2017, or SITSA as an acronym for short, as well as Senator Johnson's SOFA bill, would go a long ways towards addressing fentanyl and other synthetics here at home, as well as then signaling what the Chinese government require, that we're serious about scheduling these substances and that they need to do the same. Today's witnesses will shed light on this incredible work that they've done so far, but also explain the challenges ahead. I look forward to hearing from them, and now call on our co-chairman.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I very much agree with your statement, but I'll go ahead and make mine. Fentanyl and fentanyl analogs are the primary drivers of the 49,000 opioid-related deaths that occurred in the United States in 2017. That's 49,000 people. The United States has a demand problem, and overdose deaths have reached epidemic proportions. Congress is taking steps to address the issue. Just last week, the House and Senate reached a bipartisan agreement on some legislation. The bill reauthorizes the High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program. That's a program that helps disrupt the trafficking of illicit substances, including fentanyl, and provides the Justice Department with additional tools to hold drug manufacturers and distributors responsible for failure to report suspicious orders of opioids. This legislation also increases access to treatment and reauthorizes the Office of National Drug Control Policy, which coordinates our nation's drug control strategy. I'm hopeful that when this legislation is enacted, it will help stem the tide of addiction. But unfortunately, the United States right now cannot address this problem in a vacuum. It also must be able to rely on its international partners to take immediate action. And one of those partners is China, as you have said, Mr. Chairman, where fentanyl and fentanyl analogs are primarily produced. Chemists who clandestinely produce these substances closely watch United States scheduling actions. After administrative agencies or Congress schedule synthetic drugs here, the chemists slightly alter the chemical makeup of those substances. Those altered substances are referred to as analogs. Fentanyl and its analogs are easy to obtain. They can be ordered online and distributed through independent traffickers in the United States, or through more traditional methods that involve transnational criminal organizations and cartels. Fentanyl that arrives here directly from China is, on average, more than 90% pure, while fentanyl is first sent to Mexico and then transported into the United States, it's typically less than 10% pure. Fentanyl and its analogs primarily enter our country in one of three ways. One, Chinese chemists produce them and ship them to the United States via international mail. They are then mixed with other substances or pressed into counterfeit pills resembling prescription drugs, like hydrocodone. 2, Mexican drug traffickers produce them with precursor chemicals obtained from China, or mix finished fentanyl obtained from China with other substances and then smuggle it across the southwest border. And 3rd, Chinese chemists produce them and ship them to Canada, where they are then smuggled across the northern border. Fentanyl is cheaper to produce than other plant-based drugs like heroin, and has a bigger profit margin. This was very interesting to me to find out. A $3,000 to $5,000 investment can yield a $1.5 million profit. Comparatively, a $5,000 to $7,000 investment in heroin yields roughly an $80,000 profit. So it isn't even really comparable. Since 2015, China has controlled 175 substances, including 25 fentanyl analogs. And it did so even though these substances are not widely abused in their country. Yet fentanyl continues to flood into the United States. In addition to the steep profit margins, there are many other possible reasons why this continues to occur. The first is that not all fentanyl analogs are illegal in China. Consequently, there's little incentive for the Chinese government to interdict these substances before they leave the country, typically destined for the United States, where they are illegal. The charts to my left illustrate that between 2016 and 2017, there were 1,072 seizures of fentanyl in the United States. They further demonstrate that while 68% of all global fentanyl movements originated in China, all global movements originated in China, fentanyl was only interdicted on 4 occasions before it was shipped out of China. Clearly, we need China's help. The lack of effective oversight may be another driving factor. The Chinese government has a fragmented regulatory framework. Oversight of China's pharmaceutical industry is spread across many different ministries, commissions, and agencies at the national, provincial, and local levels. This contributes to significant issues with coordination and transparency, and we need to do our best to encourage China to change this. So in stark contrast, the Chinese government has demonstrated with other issues, such as internet regulation, that when there is political will, it can effectively crack down on practices it deems undesirable. I would ask them to crack down on fentanyl. Mr. Chairman, you and I have held a number of hearings on synthetic drugs, dating back to 2011. Since then, we've worked together to pass the Transnational Drug Trafficking Act, which was enacted in 2016. And I'm pleased to say that this law has been helpful in prosecuting drug traffickers who distribute or manufacture precursor chemicals, knowing that the chemicals will be used to make illicit drugs destined for the United States. Also, since then, the Justice Department has utilized its emergency control authority on more than 15 occasions to temporarily place 56 synthetic drugs, including 17 fentanyl analogs, into Schedule I. In February of this year, the Justice Department used its emergency control authority to again temporarily place all fentanyl analogs into Schedule I. That, I think, is good news. But despite these actions, the number of fentanyl-related overdose deaths continues to increase. And this indicates our current legislative and administrative framework prevents the swift action that's needed to address this public health threat. Mr. Chairman, you've introduced legislation to stop the importation and trafficking of synthetic analogs to address the problem. I am a co-sponsor. I really believe we need to pass this. I really believe that we need to hold China responsible for some of this. I really believe that we need to see that China changes course. As you know, there have been discussions on both sides of the aisle about how this legislation might be improved, particularly as it relates to ensuring that it doesn't give too much authority to a single agency, and that manufacturers and traffickers are brought to justice in a way that's in line with your leadership on sentencing reform. So I look forward to working with you and others to make these improvements. In the meantime, though, let me go back. We've got to engage our international partners. We've got to encourage them to take immediate action to stop the illicit production and export of fentanyl. Too many lives have already been cost. It's really terrible when you look at the maps and you see how concentrated this is. Collectively, we must do more to stop this epidemic. So I really look forward to hearing from our experts on just how to do it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm anxious to sit down with you and go over that legislation and see what you think it needs to be changed or modified in some way, because you're key to our getting this passed.
I'd be happy to.
Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you and the ranking member having today's hearing. I just wanted to make a couple of brief comments. When you look at 72,000 Americans losing their lives to overdoses last year, according to the Center for Disease Control, it strikes me as odd that our response as a nation has been so timid. Let me explain what I mean by that. Certainly, there is a demand problem here in the United States that is creating a market for the drugs that come across our border or across our seas, and we are not doing enough, in my view, to deal with the demand side. Our friends in Mexico, for example, when I was in Mexico City a few weeks ago, they consider this to be an American problem because of the demand, not a Mexican problem, even though 90% of the heroin, which is an opioid, of course, is grown and produced in Mexico, of which we have a 2,000-mile common border, 1,200 miles in my state, and of course, Senator Feinstein's state as well. I just wonder, thinking back on what happened after 9/11, 3,000 Americans died, and of course, more died at the Pentagon on that terrible day, what our national response has been. And it strikes me as disproportionate, is probably the mildest term I could use, that given the fact that 72,000 Americans have died just last year due to overdoses, and about 49,000 of them, as Senator Feinstein said, from opioids. And then you look at the mixture of these drugs, heroin, fentanyl, and others. Sometimes it's hard to tell exactly what it is, but we do know, as I said, that 90% of that heroin comes from Mexico. And I think we need to focus on that a lot more and to do a lot more. I heard one person say a few months ago that the cartels are commodity agnostic. In other words, they'll ship anything across our border that makes them money. Traffic in human beings, they'll encourage people from Central America to come across at $5,000, $6,000 a pop. And of course, they'll transit drugs into the United States and other contraband as well. But the price of the drug war in Mexico itself among the cartels has been staggering. The Mexican government only controls, well, they don't control about a third or more of their own country. The cartels do. And since 2007, more people, I'm told, have died as a result of violence in Mexico than have died in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq combined. To me, these are shocking figures and should be a call to arms on the part of all of the elements of the United States government. So I'm glad you're looking at this, Mr. Chairman. The fentanyl is one piece of a very large and complex puzzle, but certainly an important one. So I appreciate your focusing on that today.
Our first witness is Kirsten Madison, Assistant Secretary, Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, State Department. In this capacity, she's responsible for that department's program combating illicit drugs and organized crime, as well as support for law enforcement and rule of law. Next, we have Paul E. Knierim, Deputy Chief of Operations, Office of Global Enforcement, Drug Enforcement Administration at the Department of Justice. In his capacity, Mr. Knierim is responsible for establishing seamless law enforcement strategies and overseeing operations designed to disrupt and dismantle national, international drug trafficking organizations, significantly impacting our country. Matthew C. Allen, Assistant Director of Investigative Programs, Homeland Security Investigations, Immigration and Customs Enforcement at Homeland Security Department. He is responsible for programmatic oversight of his department's strategic planning, national policy implementation, and the development and execution of operational initiatives, and collaborates with his department's operations to ensure the implementation of investigative activities and programs in conformance with national priorities, the department's strategic goals and performance measures. Lastly, Daniel Burke, Senior Operations Manager, Cybercrime Investigations and Digital Forensics, Office of Criminal Investigation, Food and Drug Administration, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. During his career, Mr. Burke has completed a number of successful cybercrime investigations spanning the globe and is also part of OCI's cadre of digital forensic specialists. None of you have to ask if your entire longer statements will be put in the record, because they will be, and I hope you have a lot more to say than the 5 minutes you have. So proceed, Ms. Madison.
Chairman Grassley, Co-Chairwoman Feinstein, distinguished members of the caucus, thank you for your tireless efforts to combat the illicit drug trade and to highlight the tragic impact of synthetics on our country. My INL team understands that the work we do every day to forge partnerships and consensus, to secure international cooperation, and to build the capacity of our partners is about one thing: it's about saving American lives. Importantly, illicit synthetic drugs are not displacing other illicit drugs. They're supplementing their supply, and when combined with them are increasing their potential lethality. So this new challenge must be addressed even as we continue to combat cocaine, methamphetamines, and heroin trafficking in the Americas and beyond. As China is the primary global source of illicit synthetic opioids today, state and its interagency partners are working every day to build upon the commitments made by President Trump and President Xi in November 2017, a meeting in which they committed to deepen bilateral counter-narcotics cooperation. Engagement has yielded increased law enforcement information sharing, arrests, seizures, and takedowns of clandestine labs, as I'm sure my colleagues will lay out for you. We are focused on growing political will within the Chinese government to work with us. The Secretary and Deputy Secretary, U.S. Ambassador Branstad, and others, including myself, press for deeper cooperation at every opportunity. State, Justice, and DHS co-chair a senior-level dialogue as part of the U.S.-China law enforcement and cybersecurity dialogue, and there's a counter-narcotics working group that was established and is intended to drive practical action. Despite very strong headwinds in the bilateral relationship, Chinese officials have continued to say that they want to deepen counter-narcotics cooperation, and we're going to continue to press them to do so. Of course, increasing China's domestic controls of synthetics and precursors is critical, as you all have highlighted. We've put states' resources and engagement to work, working closely with our interagency partners to provide Chinese regulatory authorities with scientific data and information, which has fed the process that led to China controlling 175 substances, including 25 fentanyl analogs and key precursor chemicals. Despite this progress, we all know that there is much more work to be done. INL funds at this time a DOJ regional legal advisor at Department of Justice who is working with others in Embassy Beijing to see if we can identify a technical path forward on China class scheduling. This is our #1 drug control ask of the Chinese government. Enabling practical law enforcement cooperation is an essential component of U.S. engagement with China. INL funds DEA specialized training programs for China's Narcotics Control Bureau and also supports exchanges with Chinese national narcotics laboratory chemists to share information on emerging substances, trends, and sampling standards. This feeds the scheduling process in China. In addition, we work at the International Narcotics Control Board on information sharing platforms and tools that enable direct cooperation between Chinese and U.S. law enforcement officials like DEA, agencies like DEA and U.S. Postal Inspection Service, as well as with other countries. Multilaterally, state is working to secure additional international controls and to build the capacity of other partners to really try and narrow the space in which criminals are operating globally on this issue. In March 2018, we mobilized countries to control the deadly opioid carfentanil and other fentanyl analogs at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs. In 2017, we secured international control of the precursors NPP and ANPP. And recently, at our instigation, the INCB called on all nations to voluntarily restrict 93 new substances with no known medical use, including many fentanyl analogs. With U.S. support, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime is developing a toolkit of draft laws and regulations, data sharing arrangements, and approaches to treatment and prevention to help other countries address the threat of illicit synthetics, because this is, in fact, a global market, to ensure that countries can institute and enforce the controls that are created at an international level. We're supporting bilateral and multilateral training of foreign law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and forensic officials. We are also working to adapt INL's work to address what we think is a very dynamic threat. As part of this effort, we're building new partnerships with the World Health Organization to accelerate the pace at which emerging synthetics are controlled, and with INCB to help countries identify and interdict illegal drugs in the global mail system. This is not a uniquely American concern, nor will the solution be ours alone. State is encouraging other partners, some already feeling the impact of synthetic opioids, to work with us to press China to do more. The Department of State is fully committed to fighting the new threat posed by synthetic drugs. We know there are no quick fixes, but we also know, and I think all the interagency partners represented here and elsewhere know, that anything we do to take this on will save American lives. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Madison. Now, Mr. Kinhera.
Good morning, Chairman Grassley, Co-Chairman Feinstein, and members of the caucus. It's an honor to appear before you today to discuss DEA's cooperation with China, Mexico, and our worldwide enforcement efforts to combat the opioid crisis. Heroin, fentanyl, and related analogs are the #1 drug threat to our nation. Sadly, the use of these illicit drugs is destroying individuals, families, and American communities on a daily basis and in record numbers. Over the last several years, we have witnessed a dangerous new trend, the convergence of the synthetic drug threat and the epidemic of opioid abuse. Defeating this epidemic will require a community effort at every level, state, local, federal, and with our international partners, especially China and Mexico. Fentanyl and related analogs are often shipped directly to the U.S. via postal or express mail from China. These synthetics are cheap to make, hard to detect, and dangerously potent. A kilogram of fentanyl from China can be purchased for less than $5,000, and potential profits from the sale of that kilogram yields roughly $1.5 million. Further complicating the crisis are transnational criminal organizations. Let me be clear. The most significant criminal threat to the United States are the Mexican drug cartels. The cartels continue to be the primary source of illicit drugs that are decimating our communities. Now, Chinese and Mexican nationals are increasingly operating in concert, resulting in an alignment responsible for the proliferation of heroin, fentanyl, and related synthetics coming across the southwest border. This leads me to what DEA is doing to counter the threat. We recognize this will take persistent efforts across a broad spectrum to include interagency and global partnerships. For decades, we've maintained a worldwide presence to address the source of drugs, and in this case, we have a robust presence and critical partnerships in both Mexico and China. Over the past decade, our relationship with China has steadily progressed. Many of the synthetic drugs encountered in the U.S. were not controlled in China. Through continued engagements by DEA and DOJ highlighting the serious issue, China passed legislation in 2015 that improved their ability to more effectively control newly identified destructive substances. China has now controlled 175 new psychoactive substances and precursor chemicals, which have a direct and immediate effect on the availability of these drugs in the United States. We are also encouraged by recent discussions with Chinese drug control officials about the prospect of scheduling fentanyl as a class. This would eliminate the need to control fentanyl and related substances one by one. While we are appreciative of China's scheduling actions and enhanced cooperation on investigations, there is opportunity for more to be done. In 2019, DEA will be opening a new office in Guangzhou, China, where much of the shipping of fentanyl and other illicit drugs originate, to facilitate greater collaboration with our law enforcement counterparts and INL. We are also looking at opening an office in Shanghai as well. In Mexico, DEA continues to synchronize and expand capabilities to combat the growing epidemic. We have developed a bilateral heroin strategy for intelligence sharing, coordinated investigations, training, increased sharing of forensic information, and the control of precursor chemicals. We participate in the North American Drug Dialogue, along with federal government officials from Mexico, Canada, and the United States, to include INL, which focuses on building a strategy to attack the production, trafficking, consumption, and misuse of illicit narcotics in North America. Domestically, DEA has moved aggressively to place temporary Schedule I controls on new and emerging synthetic drugs. Unfortunately, the temporary emergency scheduling process of a substance is reactive, requiring us to first observe the deadly consequences of synthetic drug abuse before initiating control. Given the proliferation of synthetic substances, including fentanyl, across the nation, it is necessary to explore novel solutions to more expeditiously schedule these new substances. On February 6, 2018, DEA proactively placed temporary emergency controls on the entire class of fentanyl-related substances to curb fentanyl-related overdose deaths. This is an unprecedented step to combat an unprecedented threat. In closing, we are grateful for the tremendous support that Congress has provided DEA to combat the national crisis. In addition to increased resources that Congress has granted, the House passed H.R. 2851, Stop the Importation and Trafficking of Synthetic Analogs Act, which DEA believes is a critical tool to combat the synthetic analog threat and save lives. We look forward to continue our work with you and your Senate colleagues to identify the resources and authorities necessary to address this devastating crisis and have a positive impact in our communities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on this very important issue, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Knierim. Now, Mr. Allen.
Chairman Glassley, Co-Chair Feinstein, and distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the illicit fentanyl from China and the efforts of Homeland Security investigations to target, investigate, disrupt, dismantle, and bring to justice criminal elements responsible. As the agency responsible for investigating violations of law governing the illicit international movement of goods and people, we recognize that the global movement of opioids, including fentanyl, is having a devastating impact on our country. As you mentioned about our statements being in the record, I'm going to summarize my statement and highlight HSI's various lines of effort to combat the flow of fentanyl into the United States. Specifically, I will talk about our Border Enforcement Security Task Forces, our involvement in the National Targeting Center, HSI's Cyber Crimes Division, and our financial investigations. And finally, we recognize that this fight does not begin or end at our borders. So I will discuss how ICE and HSI are sharing intelligence and working jointly with our law enforcement partners in China to attack the problem before it reaches our shores. For HSI, the Border Enforcement Security Task Forces are our primary platform to investigate opioid smuggling. Through the BESTs, HSI utilizes our unique customs and immigration authorities and leverages critical partnerships with state, local, and federal partners to maximize our impact on TCOs. HSI currently operates BEST in 62 locations throughout the United States, and BEST leverages the participation of more than 1,000 other federal, state, local, and foreign law enforcement agencies and officers. In response to the crisis, HSI, with very significant input from Customs and Border Protection and DEA, established the BEST at an express consignment carrier facility in Memphis, Tennessee, to specifically target opioid shipments. With support from the Department of Justice's Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, BEST Memphis is maximizing fentanyl interdictions and opportunities to investigate follow-up. Recognizing that fentanyl is also arriving in international mail, HSI, Customs and Border Protection, the Food and Drug Administration, DEA, and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service are also collaborating to increase the interdiction of fentanyl transiting through the mail facilities and using BEST task forces to do that. In order to further increase the interdiction of fentanyl, HSI has detailed dozens of agents to work at Customs and Border Protection's National Targeting Center, which serves as DHS's Center of Excellence for Targeting. HSI's presence at the NTC leverages intelligence gathered during HSI investigations to improve CBP's targeting efforts. In turn, the increased interdiction by CBP enhances HSI investigations, and CBP's holdings assist HSI in expanding cases and our picture of criminal networks. As transnational criminal activity continues to expand into the online world, HSI faces growing demand for cyber investigative expertise. In 2014, HSI conducted only 37 cybercrime investigations that did not involve child exploitation. By 2015, that number approached 100. Today, HSI has over 600 open cybercrime investigations, over 100 of which specifically target darknet illicit marketplaces, and most of those involve narcotics smuggling. On the financial front, identifying, analyzing, and investigating the payment systems that facilitate the purchase and smuggling of fentanyl are critical to the disruption and the dismantlement of networks. HSI has identified 2 key payment systems which support illicit procurement of opioids: money service businesses and cryptocurrencies. Generally, illicit opioids that are purchased on the internet are paid for through licensed MSBs. On darknet marketplaces, purchases are often paid for with cryptocurrencies. In response to the growth of cryptocurrency's role in crime, HSI trains investigators from national and international agencies in cryptocurrency investigations in an effort to increase law enforcement capabilities and deter criminal organizations from laundering proceeds or using cryptocurrencies. And finally, there is no single entity or organization that can stop the flow of dangerous illicit drugs like fentanyl into the U.S. Tackling this complex threat requires that a united, comprehensive strategy and an aggressive approach be taken on multiple entities across all levels of government. And this collaboration does not end with our domestic partners. To fully identify the TCOs involved in the fentanyl trade, we will need the assistance of our international partners. In order to accomplish this, HSI uses its attaché network throughout the world, which works side by side with host country law enforcement every day. In 2017, an investigation into fentanyl smuggling from China was initiated by our attaché office in Guangzhou, China, and our HSI New Orleans office. HSI worked with the Chinese Narcotics Control Bureau to target the TCO. The information shared by HSI prompted Chinese authorities to conduct enforcement actions across multiple Chinese provinces. Moreover, at a press conference in Beijing in December of 2017, the INCB announced changes to the Chinese Narcotics Control List, and the INCB referenced the HSI-INCB investigations of the TCO as a contributor to these expanded control measures. This represents the first case in which U.S. and Chinese law enforcement have cooperated in this way. I thank you for the opportunity to appear today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen. Now, Mr. Daniel.
Good morning, Chairman Grassley, Co-Chair Feinstein, and other distinguished members of the caucus. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the efforts of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to disrupt and dismantle illegal online pharmacies that facilitate trade in illegal pharmaceuticals, including illicit fentanyl and other harmful substances. As FDA's criminal law enforcement arm, the Office of Criminal Investigations protects the public health of Americans by conducting criminal investigations of illegal activities involving FDA-regulated products, arresting those responsible, and working with the Department of Justice for prosecution. Since our inception in 1993, OCI has investigated thousands of criminal schemes involving a broad range of illegal conduct, including the illegal manufacture and trafficking of counterfeit, unapproved, or misbranded drugs and medical products, theft and diversion of prescription drugs, and fraudulent schemes involving bogus cures for cancer and other diseases. As a senior operations manager, I direct the investigative activities of the special agents within the Cybercrime Investigations Unit, or CCIU. CCIU was launched in 2013 specifically to address the sale of counterfeit drugs, tainted dietary supplements, and other potentially dangerous FDA-regulated products on the internet. CCIU also targets the online infrastructure that supports the illegal distribution of pharmaceuticals on the internet. In fiscal year 2017, OCI's internet-related cases resulted in 44 arrests, 33 convictions, fines and restitutions totaling $5.8 million, and the seizure of assets valued at over $33 million. Our agents have also seized a total of 4,229 domain names via court order. To ensure we don't duplicate the efforts of DEA, ICE, HSI, and our other law enforcement partners, we focus our efforts involving controlled substances specifically to drug counterfeiting operations. Many of these investigations involve raw materials or tooling originally manufactured in China and mailed to the United States. As an example, just last month, an OCI-led investigation resulted in the arrest and indictment of a San Diego resident known as the Drug Llama on a darknet marketplace. The suspect in this case is alleged to be responsible for shipping over 50,000 counterfeit oxycodone tablets containing fentanyl throughout the United States via the darknet marketplace Dream Market. In an effort to combat the tens of thousands of websites offering illegal pharmaceutical drugs to Americans sourced from clandestine supply chains, we often send complaints about illegal activities to domain name registries and registrars. Many of the domain names linked to online pharmacies clearly indicate the function and purpose of the website. For example, buyhydrocodoneonline.com or buyclonopin.com, two domain names we recently seized. Although some registries and registrars are very responsive to our concerns, others have been much less so. This past June, FDA convened internet stakeholders, government entities, and academic researchers, as well as advisory groups, at a one-day online opioid summit to discuss ways to collaboratively take stronger action in combating the opioid crisis by reducing the availability of illicit opioids online. The dialogue is ongoing, and we are hopeful that raising the issue in this high-level forum caused many of these companies to think about their policies with regard to the use of their platforms to sell drugs. Each year, FDA participates in Operation Pangea, a global effort led by Interpol to combat the unlawful sale and distribution of illegal and potentially counterfeit or substandard products on the internet. During Operation Pangea 10, FDA sent 13 warning letters to the operators of 401 websites selling opioids and seized nearly 100 website domain names. Earlier this year, FDA hosted a meeting with a delegation from the Chinese Ministry of Public Security, specifically to learn about each country's approach to combating counterfeit food, drugs, tobacco, and medical devices. The dialogue included mechanisms for sharing information and conducting coordinated investigations. In my experience, Chinese authorities are generally receptive to working with FDA OCI, and we have shared actionable intelligence regarding drug counterfeiting operations in China. The result of this information sharing, however, is not always clear. FDA has a narrow but important role in combating the online sale of opioids. We need to rely on cooperation, not only with our international partners such as China, but also with internet stakeholders to find workable solutions to effectively combat illegal internet operations dealing drugs. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to any questions.
We'll have a 5-minute round of questions, and you've got to go. Okay. Are you coming back? Okay. I have so many questions, we'll probably have to submit some for answer in writing. I'm going to start with Mr. Knierim. I won't go into the details about the legislation that Senator Feinstein and I have put in because we've explained it. I could explain the goal is to make our government be more nimble and address new substances more quickly and more directly as they emerge from the black market. And then also I brought up Senator Portman's bill. So my first question to you is how would CITSA impact DEA's effort to combat fentanyl and other synthetic drugs, and address that same thing for Senator Portman's bill?
Senator, thank you very much for the question. DEA, DOJ, and the administration support the passage of CITSA. Specifically, it is a top legislative priority for DEA as the existing scheduling process to temporarily schedule the substances reactionary and not agile enough to keep up with bad actors engineering illicit substances for the express purpose of skirting our laws. CITSA would enable DEA to more efficiently control synthetic analog substances as they emerge, providing law enforcement with a much-needed tool to enable us to keep up with this fast-moving threat. With regard to SOFA, DEA and DOJ have not taken a position on those, but we do feel like these should be Schedule I substances as evidenced by our emergency scheduling of fentanyl analogs as a class. And we look forward to working with you and your colleagues on legislation that will continue to provide us the tools to address the threat.
Okay, even though you haven't taken a stand on the legislation, if it were to pass similar to what, let's say, like it's introduced, would that have an impact on our relationship with the Chinese government in fighting this fentanyl production?
In my experience, I believe the key is the relationship and the partnership with China in providing us the opportunity to provide them the evidence base that they need to help with the scheduling of these in China. We have seen any time that they control, as has been mentioned a couple of times today, 175 substances, that has an immediate impact on the availability of those substances that are submitted to our forensic laboratories for analysis. So we believe that we're engaging with them on identifying the mechanisms to control fentanyl as a class in China, and anything that we can do to add additional controls to the United States would provide those tools and the mechanisms for that bilateral effort with our Chinese partners.
Yeah. So Ms. Madison, or Secretary Madison, and you mentioned my former governor, Ambassador Branstad. He made a trip here just specifically to talk about that with several members of Congress. How helpful has the Chinese government been in identifying sources of fentanyl and other synthetics?
Senator, as you've heard from my colleagues and in my testimony, the Chinese actually have been helpful in scheduling fentanyl, and they've been helpful in some areas on law enforcement and in working with us on things like scheduling. I think we want them to do much more, obviously, but there is some demonstration of will to work on these issues. We very much want them to proceed and schedule by class because we think that would be a real game changer if they would do that. But we are seeing some cooperation. It's not as much as we'd like.
I have the idea, and you tell me to the extent to which I'm wrong, that it seems that just at the highest levels of government in China, they don't want to publicly acknowledge China's role in this international health crisis. Am I wrong on that?
Senator, I certainly have seen.
To tell me I'm wrong.
I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. I think that we've seen some pushback, and if you read the media from the Chinese government on the question of their role, I would say that our conversations with them, we try to keep it very, very concrete. We exchange chemists with them. We bring them here to see our treatment programs because we're trying to make sure that they understand the depth of this crisis in this country and that they understand that we have a fact pattern that demonstrates that they're a source and that we need their cooperation. They have a very complex, a very long scheduling process, and the things they look at, among other things, are the country that requests it, the level of effort in that country to address demand, the actions that country is taking itself to control. So I think we are always working to demonstrate, Paul may have more to add on this, but we're always working to demonstrate very concretely what's happening, what we're seeing here, and what the impact is in our country.
Okay. Senator Feinstein. We may have time for a second round here with only 3 of us here.
Is it Kieran? Knierim. Mr. Knierim, I want to ask you a question, and maybe others will have a comment. In 2016, Jian Zhang, a Chinese national, was indicted in the United States on charges of distributing controlled sentences and controlled substance analogs, resulting in serious bodily injury and death, among others. It is my understanding that Mr. Zhang may have owned and operated a legal business in China, but he also used that same company to produce and export fentanyl and fentanyl analogs to the United States. As a result, He and 4 of his family members were designated as kingpins and indicted. To what extent, if at all, is it common practice in China for legally operating businesses to also produce and export illicit substances to the United States?
Thank you, Senator. I'm not sure the extent that the illicit companies are using their companies for illicit purposes, but I think that does bring home kind of the situation when we're talking about the ability to engineer and change the molecular structure of these substances that are controlled. And as has been mentioned, when China does control and regulate these substances, there is an impact in the U.S. So that is one of I think the challenges is making sure that we're in a position to provide that scientific evidence-based information to our Chinese partners so that they can add additional controls to avoid the very issue that you're talking about.
Well, just a comment. I've had a long history with China and have made many trips, and at one point knew a great many of the leaders. It seems to me, what I know, if the leadership said, knock this off, do something about it, it's affecting us internationally, it would happen. Do you not agree?
What I can tell you is the relationship that we have with them has had an impact. And so I believe that our continued engagement over the last 30 years and the reason why we want to open an office and are going to open an office in Guangzhou is to further strengthen those partnerships, and that engagement will have a continued impact. And so I think that it's imperative to us to continue to build upon those partnerships, to continue to provide them the information and work with them bilaterally on investigations, and to continue our investigative efforts on an interagency process in the U.S. as well.
Do you believe that most of the activity is coming out of Guangzhou, or would it be Shanghai?
We understand that a lot of it is coming out of Guangzhou, which is why that is our first priority in opening a second office in China, and then looking to establish our third would be in Shanghai to further address the issue.
I think that's very good. I am of the view that it really has to be addressed with the Chinese, and that the Chinese have to set the example. Let me go on. So, in your estimation, does a lack of oversight that with all these commissions and different things they have at the provincial level exist now due to the economic benefits of fentanyl production and smuggling?
I would characterize it as more of our opportunity to further strengthen the engagement that we have with them to collaboratively and collectively address the issue. Again, from an investigative standpoint, the sharing of information and working collaboratively with them to identify those organizations and cartels and non-cartel affiliated individuals, as we've seen also here in the United States, that have the ability to order and obtain these products over the internet and online. So I think it's maintaining and ensuring that we have those engagements at the proper levels within the Ministry of Public Security as well as with the provincial level.
Thank you. Mr. Allen, data from your agency, as well as from Customs and Border Protection, indicates that over 60% of the fentanyl that comes into the United States comes in through my state, California ports of entry. Despite this, it seems there's a prioritization on the exclusion of immigrants over the exclusion of illicit drugs. Has this shift in focus impacted your agency's ability to adequately detect and interdict fentanyl and other illicit drugs at the California ports of entry before they enter the country?
Well, first, recognizing that I'm a witness from Homeland Security Investigations, I can't necessarily speak to Customs and Border Protection staffing at the ports of entry, but what I can assure you is that across the DHS enterprise, from CBP to ICE and in particular to HSI, the Secretary and the administration have made it very clear that fentanyl and opioid interdiction is a priority for us. Earlier, when I talked about the Border Enforcement Security Task Forces and the role that they play for us, as a result of the President's executive order on transnational crime, we've actually increased the number of BESTs by 40% in order to recognize the threat, shift resources, and speaks to I think one of the members' comments about agility and our need and the requirement that we adjust to threats as they change. We have redirected resources to both international mail facilities and express consignment facilities in order to address the threat and do more interdiction and focus on reduction of supply, while other organizations and other parts of the government focus on prevention and treatment. But we definitely have to have a holistic view. But the DHS agencies, both from ICE and CBP, are focusing on the target.
Thank you very much for that.
Senator Heitkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman, I guess that's what we're at.
Co-chairman.
Co-chairs. Thank you so much. I think a lot of you know that Operation Denial was a North Dakota operation after a tragic death of a young teenager who died from fentanyl. We were able to trace it back through Portland, through the dark web to Portland, all the way Canada, Portland, all the way back to China. We have, I understand it, 5 indictments against Chinese nationals. Are we any closer to extradition? And wouldn't that be a good faith effort on China's part to actually extradite folks who are peddling this in our country? Mr. Allen, I'll take it from you.
We played a very significant role in Operation Denial, worked jointly with DEA and DOJ and the Canadians. I would say yes, the more violators that we can bring to justice in the United States and subject to the U.S. judicial system, the better off we will be. But I think, as you can acknowledge, there will be very significant challenges, and China does not necessarily extradite their nationals to face justice in the United States, and those are largely regulated by treaty between the two.
So what do we know about these 5 individuals? Are they still at large in China, or has China done any interdiction on their end as a result of the scheduling?
Scheduling or the indictment?
But the indictment.
I'm not aware of
I mean, if China now is scheduling these drugs as illegal, are they now attempting to enforce their laws against these 5 individuals and apprehend them and bring them to justice in China?
I can't speak to those 5 individuals, but they, in other joint work that we've done with them, they have arrested Chinese nationals under Chinese law and to face justice.
And what level of cooperation and communication do you have, Mr. Allen, when they do that?
At the case level, we do have good cooperation and coordination. In fact, in the investigation that I referred to earlier, we recently hosted a Chinese delegation in Louisiana to talk about the next steps in that investigation.
My point is that these are transnational criminal organizations. And you made an excellent point that when you find drugs, you're going to find human trafficking, you're going to find human sex trafficking. After our drug agents did this investigation, they found out you can buy a tiger on the dark web using cryptocurrency. So, we're behind the 8 ball here. And my concern is that if we focus solely on China, what happens when it moves to Malaysia? What happens when it moves to Vietnam? What happens when it moves to another country? Because the Chinese government feels American pressure to try and prevent that kind of activity within the boundaries of China. What would you recommend so that we stay ahead of the next leap of these transnational criminal organizations?
Well, first, I would assure you that the agencies that are sitting here and many others are focused very much on, whether the threat moves, and will be ready if it does migrate to another part of the world.
Ready how?
By making sure that we have relationships in those countries, by making sure that we have personnel that are assigned there in our various international operations so that we can work with counterparts to address the threat. But also, making sure that, it's not necessarily for DHS, and I'll defer to Paul, but having the right framework here in the United States and doing class scheduling of fentanyl and analogs, I think would be a good first step to make sure that no matter where in the world fentanyl or other synthetics are coming from, that we have the right framework here first.
Yeah, my concern is that, while we're trying to tackle this problem by getting after the demand side of it and taking a look at what we can do. We cannot stop trying to prevent supply from entering this country. I think a lot of people think law enforcement should be secondary. I can tell you as a student of public health, one of the first things we want to do is drive up the price. And you're seeing that a little bit with these drugs because you're seeing methamphetamines come back, roaring back in states like mine as an alternative to more expensive opioids, more expensive other kinds of drugs, and so prescription drugs. And so my concern is that we need a very, very robust law enforcement presence, that we cannot leave law enforcement behind while we're trying to tackle the demand side, and that includes transnational efforts. And so you guys need to tell us what you need. You need to tell us how you're going to manage that next leap, because I think this myopic focus on China ignores the fact that this is just going to jump to another location.
I don't think you would find any disagreement here. Mr. Knierim talked about the dominant threat still being Mexico. And I think across the board, we need to remember that. I spent a dozen years working on the southwest border of the United States with Mexico, and I still see the Mexican cartels as the dominant drug threat to this country.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I just want to make this point. I was on the border in El Paso with the consulate there a couple years ago, and we were talking about white powder. I mean, used to be it was black tar heroin coming up to states like mine. That was kind of the beginning of what we were seeing. Now we're seeing white powder, and DEA was like nodding their head, we get it. And the rest of the agencies were like, no, that's not happening. And I'm like, you guys need to get on the same page, because I believe that as you see marijuana becoming recreationally available in this country, a lot of that is going to leap to the next substance. And that next substance, so you see pictures of people walking across the border. It used to be huge bales of marijuana. Now it's smaller packs to avoid those points of entry. It's smaller packs of more different kinds of drugs that are walking across the border. So we've got to get this problem tackled. But the largest fentanyl, can someone just confirm for me, the largest fentanyl apprehension we have has been through a point of entry, a water port in California. Is that correct? San Diego?
Go ahead and answer it, then I'll call on Senator Whitehouse.
I'm not sure that's the case. We recently had a 50-kilo seizure of fentanyl from China in air freight in Philadelphia.
Right. But I just want to make this point. You know, as we focus solely on the southern border, southwest border, we may, as Senator Feinstein has talked about, we may be moving resources to locations that open up advantage or opportunities in other places. And so we need to secure all our borders, whether they're maritime, whether they're Canadian, or whether they're southwest.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks, Chairman, and thank you all for being here. There is a report from the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative Washington think tank. We don't always agree. So at least on this one, I agree with them very strongly. And it points out that in our relationships with China, I quote them here, halting illegal drug trade and improving oversight of legal drug trade is an underrated issue as compared to the attention given to the trade balance and protection of intellectual property. The Communist Party has failed to properly safeguard public health at home and undoubtedly has the capacity to curb large-scale export of illegal drugs to the U.S. It has intentionally or unintentionally decided these actions are not worth their costs, end quote. I think we have the capacity to affect that judgment on the part of the Chinese. I think obviously in the trade war we're at right now, it's a little bit hard to highlight that because there's so many points of conflict that have emerged. But I do recall when we were battling with them on the wholesale theft of intellectual property, the industrial espionage program that they run, that the Department of Justice, after considerable wobbling for a while, decided that they were going to go ahead and indict 5 members, if I recall the number, of the Chinese military officers who were engaged in industrial espionage. And that was a real reset, in my view, for the Chinese. So I know that we've got all sorts of problems with fentanyl coming across the Mexican border, but in China, the power of the government over the country is pretty well undisputed, and here's AEI saying they could do a lot more if they cared to and if we raised the price for them. So I guess my question to you, Ms. Madison, and to you, Mr. Knierim, are what would you recommend as further steps to raise the price for the Chinese so that they're less tolerant of fentanyl being manufactured in their country and then mailed and shipped to users and distributors, illicit users and distributors in the United States?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think that what we are seeing so far with China is that our efforts to engage them and to make a substantive case about control and to make the case about the impact that the export of these illicit synthetics are having on our country are helping us to make progress in them moving to control and in them working with us on law enforcement cooperation. So at the moment, that is helping to move the ball forward. I agree that there is much more to be done and that they could do more. The question of how you advance that, at the moment, I think that we see progress in the approach that we're taking. And I would note that the counter-narcotics piece is probably in a relationship that has a lot of points of tension is one of the areas where we're actually making progress. Not as fast as we would like to, not as far as we would like to, but I do think it's an area where we're actually making progress.
This conversation rings a bell for me because I've had it before. You take out the word synthetics and you put in cyber spying on American infrastructure, their Chinese industrial espionage. And we were, making progress in conversations with them, but my recollection was that the nature of the conversation shifted a lot when the conspiracy indictment came down naming fairly senior Chinese military officers. So I'm not sure I pronounced your name correctly, sir. Is it Knierim?
Knierim is.
Knierim.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Knierim, could you report a little bit on the Department of Justice's work in, I know obviously ongoing investigations need to be protected, but on the extent to which this is a priority and what cases you've already made that involve Chinese nationals in the fentanyl distribution business to the United States?
Well, first I can let you know that this is an urgent and critical priority for us, and we recognize that persistence efforts are going to be extremely important as we move forward. I also want to let you know that we are extremely committed to our partnerships with our Chinese and Mexican partners. I'm confident that both our Chinese and Mexican partners do recognize that this is an issue for us, and I firmly believe that when we are able to work with China on identifying the precursors and the substances that are causing serious issues in the United States, these fentanyl-related substances, and when they do control them, we do see an impact. We're talking about substances that are not illegal in China in some cases, and so, again, their laws, and I think they've taken a very aggressive approach in working with us and controlling these substances, 175 to date. So I think it's that continued engagement, the continued relationship, expanding and furthering our investigative efforts, continuing to provide them the scientific evidence of the substances that we are finding here in the U.S. so that they can further control additional substances, and to continue to engage with them on controlling fentanyl as a class, as we've been discussing.
Has any indictment or information been returned or obtained against any Chinese national related to the fentanyl trade?
In the U.S.?
In the U.S.
Yes. Yeah, there have been several indictments that have been discussed, some recently in the District of North Dakota.
Great. Thank you. My time has expired, Chairman. Thank you.
I was going to do a second round of questions, but I guess with the time that we have now left to call the second panel, so Senator, Special Agent Burke, you didn't get asked any questions. You'll have to answer some in writing.
Next time,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Thank you all very much for being here. And we'll call up the second panel now. this Frunze or Frunze? And it's scissors. You gentlemen heard me thank the panel, first panel, for the hard work of putting together your testimony. I thank you. I'm going to introduce you now, and then you give your testimony, and probably we'll have time for questions for you. Dr. Scissors is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on Chinese and Indian economies and on U.S. economic relations with Asia. Dr. Scissors is chief economist of the China Beige Book, is the author of China's Global Investment Tracker, and the author of a series of papers chronicling the end of pro-market Chinese reform. Dr. Frunze is products manager at optical products at Smith's Detection. He is subject matter expert for infrared, Raman hyperspectral, and other optical technology, specializes in development, deployment, global life cycle, management of sensor products for chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive threats, and narcotics identification applications for military, transportation, security, law enforcement, and urban production markets. Quite a portfolio you have there. Matthew Nice is manager of the International Narcotics Control Board Operational Partnership to interdict opioids illicit distribution and sales project. That goes by the acronym of opioids. The project involves United Nations agencies and private partners' engagement in practical action to ensure that first responders at the risk of fentanyl and fentanyl analog exposure can safely carry out their functions and serve their communities. We'll start with you, Dr. Scissor, and just go from my left to my right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry Senator Whitehouse left because I wanted to tell him that the author of that quote is truly a brilliant researcher and also modest. He already gave away my headline. I will say that this is, fentanyl is not the trade deficit covering hundreds of billions of dollars of exchange. It's not China pursuing its development model. There's no good reason for the Chinese not to be good cooperative partners with us on this. And if they aren't, I have some suggestions for decertifying Chinese production that could be used as a coercive tool, as well as a carrot, as well as a stick. But my main point is the Chinese this is not issues where we clash with the Chinese and it's difficult to find a solution. They should cooperate. To talk about the relationship, an aspect of the relationship that's important to fentanyl, the Chinese, I think people know here, the Chinese state has a huge economic role. They interfere at the firm level on a sweeping and enduring basis. Much of the market is reserved for state-owned enterprises. The principle of reciprocity does not hold. They don't have the reasons that some countries do of lack of capacity, that some countries are genuinely not able to take the actions we might want them to take to curb illegal commerce. That is not the case in China. Now, they've wound up large private firms on short notice. This is true, and Senator Feinstein brought this up. It's only a priority. They will only make these changes if it's a priority for them, but their capacity should not be put in question. And I'll say a little bit more about that when I get to solutions. China has an important role in supply chains. These actually exaggerate the size of our trade deficit because China just assembles phones and laptops. It doesn't do much else in the production. However, in pharmaceuticals and in fine chemicals, China is crucial to the supply chain. They are the world's largest producers across a range, of the largest exporter. So unfortunately, I disagreed somewhat with Senator Heitkamp. Of course, there are other countries involved in this, but China is an irreplaceable producer, and curbing Chinese production would strike a major blow against the supply of illicit drugs into the United States. Just as an example, the Chinese are account for something like 40% of the world's production of active pharmaceutical ingredients. Their volume of trade in organic chemicals exceeds $60 billion. They're the world's largest producer of fentanyl precursors. So it is correct, as the hearing has done, to locate a significant part of the problem in China. If China's health record were perfect, this would still be an issue. But I would like to add the point, and President Trump mentioned this yesterday, and he did so correctly. China has a very questionable healthcare record at home. We had a vaccine issue this year. We had a hepatitis vaccine issue kill infants in 2013. We had melamine poisoning in 2008. The FDA cited more Chinese pharmaceutical manufacturers for violations this year than they did in 2014. So it is not clear that the problem in China is getting better. And if it's not getting better in China, it's a lot to ask for them to obey American law without pushing them. And that gets to Senator Grassley's point. One of the reasons they don't want to acknowledge, or one of Senator Grassley's points, they don't want to acknowledge their role is because acknowledging their role opens up Pandora's box domestically. It gives domestic critics of the Communist Party more ammunition to say, you even acknowledge on the international stage you're not controlling production of illegal or tainted drugs. So I have a minute left, and I really want to get to the carrot and stick because I think that's my role here, is to talk about how to influence the Chinese. The stick I would use is to decertify uncooperative provinces or municipalities. Guangzhou, which is in Guangdong, was raised as perhaps the biggest problem. We can say production that occurs in Guangzhou or Guangdong province broadly is considered unsafe with regard to public health or because legal companies there use illicit companies fraudulently to also engage in illegal activity. I would argue against applying a national sanction. I want to give good provinces and cities and good Chinese companies an incentive to behave well. So I would go with a targeted sanction, but that is a way to change the calculus of the leadership of the Communist Party. And just to close, I mentioned the trade incentives they have earlier. There's considerable Chinese export of these goods. If the U.S. were to interfere in that, they'd lose a lot more money than they're making off fentanyl. The Chinese are also active in pharmaceutical mergers and acquisitions around the world. In my written testimony, I documented some of those recent large acquisitions. They're in the multiple billions of dollars. So if we do threaten to decertify as untrustworthy Chinese firms or regions, they have a very powerful economic incentive to then cooperate.
Thank you, Dr. Scissors. Now, Mr. Frunze. Dr. Frunze.
Chairman Grassley, Co-Chairman Feinstein, members of the Senate caucus, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of Smiths Detection Incorporated, a global leader in threat detection. My name is Michael Frunze, and I am responsible for fielding products that detect and identify chemical threats, including pharmaceutical-based agents like fentanyl. Over the past year and a half, Smiths has been working with Congress to support interdicting these dangerous narcotics and protecting the health and safety of Homeland Security professionals. As we've said, nearly 20,000 Americans died from fentanyl-related overdoses in 2016, a 540% increase in 3 years. Smith supported S-708, the Interdict Act, which passed overwhelmingly in the House and Senate and was signed into law, with over $30 million following in the fiscal year 2018 Homeland Security Appropriations Act. We want to thank Senator Bozeman, Markey, and Portman and the co-sponsors of that legislation to aid Customs and Border Protection in intercepting these threats. In September 2001, letters containing anthrax were delivered to Senator Daschle and Leahy's offices, and the entire emergency response world descended into crisis mode. Overnight, the need for rapid identification of unknown materials in the field became critical to our national emergency response. Fieldable chemical detection technology supports this mission, and in the last 25 years, threat detection devices have been made smaller, more rugged, and easier to deploy. Because of its extreme potency, the synthetic opioid fentanyl and its chemical analogs present a great threat to human life, as even a small amount of airborne particles inadvertently inhaled can cause serious injury or even death. There have been multiple incidents where law enforcement officers were exposed to fentanyl in the line of duty. In Ohio, a police officer suffered a near-fatal overdose after brushing a small amount of fentanyl from his uniform following a traffic stop. In Harford County, Maryland, a sheriff was hospitalized following exposure to airborne fentanyl after opening the drawer of a bedside stand. Similar incidents have been reported in Wisconsin, Louisiana, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Smith's Detection has established a long record in support of federal customers like TSA and CBP, as well as police and fire departments in all 50 states. We've invested over $450 million in R&D in the past decade and expect to do so again in the next. Government must drive our investment by forecasting requirements and need. We have provided immediate solutions for fentanyl detection and identification by modifying and enhancing several existing products. While it is not yet possible to use field technology to trace the exact origin of illicit fentanyl, these devices have the ability to record signatures from real-world samples, which can inform trafficking and distribution patterns to help visualize larger trends. Smith's Detection is also actively developing a solution to raise the interception rate of fentanyl at package sorting facilities as well, where over 100,000 parcels are processed each night. The current proposal would constitute a system of systems approach, a multi-stage automated scanning installation where each successive stage presents a more rigorous but slower interrogation of a given package. It is unlikely that the public health threat posed by the opioid epidemic will be ameliorated anytime soon. Only a combination of law enforcement, community outreach, political overtures, and medical intervention, along with technology, will eventually solve this massive problem. In the meantime, fentanyl and the harm it can cause to users, responders, and the general public will persist. Smith's Detection will continue to move technology forward to provide flexible, innovative solutions to these and other threats, to safeguard society, protect life, and support the free flow of trade. Smith submits the following recommendations for your consideration to support the development of this equipment. 1. Establish a public-private working group to disrupt foreign shipments that includes but is not limited to the TSA, CBP, the United States Postal Service, and others in order to establish a baseline of requirements to interdict the foreign threat from China and other countries shipping opioids into the U.S. 2. Support passage of S-2763, the POWER Act, with clear appropriation lines for the next 5 fiscal years instead of just 1. This will create certainty in the marketplace and allow for private industry to plan our R&D appropriately. Introduced by Senators Brown, Markey, Rubio, and Portman, funds for portable screening devices are critical, and a major testing backlog continues to bog down state test labs. Finally, budget for the operations and maintenance of technology awarded to state and local authorities to ensure equipment is refreshed, utilized, and maintained correctly. Thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Doctor. And now, Mr. Nice.
Good morning, Chairman Grassley, Co-Chairman Feinstein, distinguished members of the caucus. It's a pleasure for me to be here today to outline the International Narcotic Control Board's Global Opioids Project and how it's helping to address the opioids crisis in the United States and well beyond its borders by supporting governments, private industry, and efforts to identify and interdict the sales and distribution of illicit, non-medical, synthetic opioids and fentanyl-related substances. The INCB is an international body established by the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, a treaty that enjoys near universal adherence. The board monitors treaty compliance and seeks to ensure that adequate supplies of drugs are available for legitimate medical and scientific purposes and to prevent the diversion of drugs and chemicals for illicit use. One of the board's main advantages is that it can serve as a neutral convener of governments as well as international and private sector entities, all of whom are threatened by the global opioids crisis. The board recognized early on that the alarming increase in overdose deaths from non-medical synthetic opioids in North America threatened to become a global challenge. In response, the board initiated its global operational partnerships to interdict opioids' illicit distribution and sales, the acronym OPIOIDS. The project is the only current international effort solely dedicated to developing partnerships with governments, international agencies, and the private sector to share information and intelligence with the goal of identifying and interdicting illicit manufacturers, distributors, and vendors of synthetic opioids. This project would not be possible without the generous support of the United States Congress through the Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. The project has benefited greatly from the support and partnership of the Drug Enforcement Administration's Special Operations Division, the United States Postal Inspection Services, and the Customs and Border Protection Service. The world is currently in the midst of a global opioids epidemic overdose. The WHO conservatively estimates 450,000 individuals died as a result of drug misuse in 2015, with 168,000 of those deaths associated with drug overdose. This rate has increased globally by 60% since 2000. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimate that overdose in the United States alone increased to 72,000 in 2017, with 49,000 of those opioid-related. Online vendors are using surface internet, darknet, and social media to offer their fentanyls. Purchases are being made with online payment services, as well as anonymous cryptocurrencies. And shipments are being trafficked within the billions of letters and express parcels that are being shipped around the world through the international mail and courier services. Details from each of these online sales, suspicious shipments, drug or illicit drug laboratory seizures represents valuable intelligence when it's shared. The Opioid Project helps to coordinate information sharing across agencies and governments. Since January, more than 200 officers from 67 countries and international agencies have become focal points for INCB communications for opioids. And since January, some 200 specific incidents involving the import, the export, seizure, or manufacture of these substances have been communicated via the Ionics communication platform. This project has focused on building strategic partnerships and strengthening cooperation with the private sector to share information that helps prevent legitimate services from being exploited by traffickers. This year, the INCB convened a series of expert working groups involving industry, government, and international community. One, partnering with Asia e-commerce companies who have voluntarily agreed to begin further enhancing efforts to identify and remove vendors that are selling fentanyls from their platforms. And another working group with express couriers and the International Express Mail Services, as well as the Universal Postal Union, to share information to disrupt dangerous fentanyl-like substances. Over the past year, the INCB has worked to schedule key fentanyl precursors. We have entered into cooperation agreements with intelligence sharing with the Universal Postal Union, and we've disseminated for governments and industry a targeted list of 93 abused fentanyls with no known legitimate purposes. 2018 marks the 30th anniversary of the last international drug control treaty. Today's drug control landscape, however, is far more complex and challenging than 1988. The INCB's Global Opioids Project represents a practical, operational approach to bring governments together with international agencies and the private sector to interdict opioids distribution. These innovative efforts help to protect citizens, our frontline personnel, and the communities they serve from exposure to these extraordinarily harmful substances. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. I'm going to start with Dr. Scissors. We hear touted a lot China's 2025 initiative, Made in China. I assume that that gives some incentives for their pharmaceutical industries to increase production and export almost everything, but in this instance, fentanyl. Do you share that concern regarding the incentives?
I do, in the following sense. China has very good reasons to emphasize their pharmaceutical industry at home. As I said, they've had health problems, they have an aging population, completely legitimate for them to say this is a priority for us. But the way Chinese industrial policy has worked is they always overshoot. There's too much capacity, there's too much competition, there are too many firms that go into business because they get government incentives at the national and local level. And of course, these firms then start suffering in their profit margins because there are too many of them. And it would not be at all surprising if they then turn more frequently to illegal activity, either illegal in China or illegal overseas. So this is a point of conversation with the Chinese. We understand your emphasis on pharmaceuticals. We get that. But the way you do it, first of all, is harmful to international trade in some cases. But second, it provides incentives for companies to go beyond what the market would say is legal commerce.
Where would you put the issue of fentanyl production on the list of priorities to be addressed by our own government to Chinese counterparts? Is this a national security issue in your mind?
You know,
that's really two questions.
Right. You could line up a bunch of China people. We'd be at each other's throats about a priority. About what's the priority. I'm gonna say this is in the group of the top priority, and the reason is that there's a debate over tech transfer in China. The Chinese say the companies want to transfer the technology to get access to the market. We say they're coerced. There shouldn't be any debate over rule of law, and this is a rule of law issue. We have an example. It's a chemical example. It's not illegal drugs, but where the Chinese government told their producers to violate U.S. antitrust law, and they testified to that in American court. It had to do with vitamin C production. That's not acceptable. So I would say you start here. You start with rule of law and say, if you want to be an economic partner of the United States, you have to obey our laws. You're not going to be perfect about it. It's a big country, but you have to give full consideration to American law. That's why I would call it the top priority, that the rule of law is really the top priority here, even ahead of other major issues we have with China.
Dr. Frunze, everything you're involved in interacts with law enforcement, I assume. Could you describe the devices on the marketplace right now, how effective they are at identifying fentanyl, and how many forms of substances the detections can reach?
Thank you for the question. There are a number of technologies, and some are single-use, some are meant to be reused, some are based on sort of chemical sort of mixing chemicals together and watching a little baggie change color. Some are very sophisticated scientific devices. There is a wide range. When we talk about detection, we talk about a yes or no. I'm unaware if there's fentanyl in front of me, and I need to be told if it is there or not. And those can be very, very sensitive, although the devices are not really general purpose. My devices are identifiers. They started with the white powder scares of 2001. There's a white powder in front of me. Is it baking soda or is it heroin cut with fentanyl? I need to know because I need to act appropriately in my response. Those can go down to a few % of fentanyl in a mixture, and visible amounts, all the way down to invisible quantities with those other more limited devices.
Mr. Nice, in your testimony, you mentioned that the Opioids Project is the only current international effort solely dedicated to developing partnerships with governments, including international agencies and the private sector. How would you describe the level of cooperation from government, international, private sector partners in the INCB's endeavors?
Excellent question. One of the focuses for us is to try to make sure that with our international partners, we look at this from a global perspective so that it's not a China-US only problem. That way we can bring in more partners to cooperate. We've been very successful with our initial work with private industry. We've had a history of working with the chemical industry for years in voluntary cooperation, and we've shown some results specifically with large platforms such as Alibaba, EC21, Tencent, to actually have them voluntarily start moving these substances off their marketplaces so that they're not involved in the transaction of these. But these are just 3 marketplaces. There are many, many more, and much more needs to be done on a voluntary basis.
Are you getting the Chinese government to participate?
Very much so. The Chinese government participates both in task force meetings as well as export working group meetings. They are always there. They are the ones that help facilitate Alibaba as well as other partners to come to the table. They are a very, very strong partner in terms of the global response to this problem.
Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nice, I think you indicated in your testimony that the IONIC system, which is hosted by the UN, provides cooperating governments with real-time communications regarding illicit manufacture, trafficking, and suspicious shipment incidences involving fentanyl, fentanyl analogs, and other new psychoactive substances. I was disappointed to learn that while 85 countries have access to this system, most, including the United States, do not use it regularly. Why is that?
I think to say that they don't use it regularly is probably not the exact way we'd like to phrase it. It's more along the lines that there are so many agencies, and since these substances aren't controlled, it's often difficult to find the right agencies in countries that have the mandate to respond to this and thus provide the information. We have been building that platform out and have increased, as I had mentioned earlier, the number of users and the number of agencies within governments, so that not only is the communication happening between governments, but also within the agencies of countries themselves. It's often the case that customs and police don't talk to each other, but it's very important that they do.
Well,
this system helps that happen.
I mean, would this be effective for us? You know the United States, you know all the jurisdictions. Could we use it effectively?
Currently, right now, our partners with the United States include the U.S. Postal Inspector Services, which are a very big partner and have provided significant amounts of information to this system. Also, we have Customs and Border Protection on the system receiving the alert notifications, and of course, DEA, both our Special Operations Division as well as DEA.
So it's happening?
It is happening, yes.
Good.
Yes.
I'm pleased to hear that. Mr. Scissors, if I can, let me go to you. I thank you for your going right to the truth of the matter and talking as bluntly and effectively as you have. What else can you say about China? Because it seems to me that a simple directive would take care of it from the head of the government, and it doesn't happen. So is that because we haven't pled our case sufficiently, or is it for other reasons?
I do think a directive from Xi Jinping obviously would matter. Enforcement of that would depend on a signal from the central government. You didn't listen, you're getting arrested. So the statement and following enforcement would make a huge difference within China. It does, unfortunately, with regard to basic human rights. It certainly can here. My opinion is we have a very long track record with the Chinese, which is if you're not prepared to coerce them, I'm not saying you should start with coercion, but if you're not prepared to coerce them, you're subject to whatever their internal decision-making is. It isn't based on justice or safety. They don't protect their own citizens that well. So for us to get them to take action that they have not been willing to take for the safety of their own citizens, it is going to require a coercive threat. I'm sorry to say that, but if you look at U.S. negotiations with China across a range of issues, I think that's the case. This is an issue of some domestic sensitivity to them. We should offer to cooperate with them. We should offer to praise them when they do something right. But I think we are going to have to coerce them to get that central government directive to start the process of enforcement.
Have we made the ask?
Yes, I mean, yes, absolutely. We are people here and on the previous panel who can detail U.S. government cooperation and private sector cooperation, international organization cooperation better than I can. But the Chinese are very aware that this is an important political issue in the United States, that it's tied to rule of law, and they have cooperated to some extent. I agree with you that they can do better if they want to. They haven't decided yet that this is a priority for them, possibly because it's confused with all the other U.S.-China issues.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here, particularly Dr. Scissors, whose report I quoted to the earlier panel. I appreciate your leadership. As you know, I'm a pretty darn progressive senator, and as you know, American Enterprise Institute is a pretty conservative organization, but I've got to say, you guys hosted the announcement of my carbon fee bill, and I appreciate that courtesy, and the work that AEI has done on kleptocracy and on the mischief associated with kleptocratic foreign leaders and how they're supported by a small group of lawyers in the rule of law countries and realtors and so forth who make kleptocracy work for them has been terrific. You guys in Hudson with their kleptocracy initiative have been among a group of organizations that have been very helpful on that. And I think that the report that you did on China and its role in the fentanyl problem here in the United States is very valuable. So I really want to thank you for that. I don't know if you've had the chance to yet comment, but I see a very distinct echo in the fentanyl problem as you probably heard me say to the previous panel, to the situation that we had when the Chinese were basically encouraging what you might call privateers, so-called private entities within China, but sanctioned by the government, to rob American companies of their intellectual property in the biggest industrial espionage scheme in history. And we talked about it a lot, and people came and sat in those chairs and said, oh yeah, we're making good progress. But then the Department of Justice came and whacked 5 Army officers who'd been involved in this with an indictment. And that was an inflection point, I believe. And so my personal experience is that talk is good, but that the ability to prove a law enforcement case, prove a criminal case against people involved in this, and then indict them. And it's tough to be under indictment. It means that you go to the wrong place and you can be arrested and brought to the country to answer charges. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on whether we've done enough on the law enforcement front to demarcate that just because you're a Chinese national doesn't mean you can get away with this, and we don't care who you are, we're coming after you if you are legally, under U.S. law, part of a conspiracy to illegally distribute fentanyl in the United States.
First of all, thank you very much for the kind words, Senator. Notwithstanding the fact that I am a free market conservative, I do like to look at the facts, and hopefully AEI does that successfully across a number of issues. I agree with your comparison to cyber. I mentioned earlier that I would actually place rule of law issues at the top of the U.S.-China agenda, which is not to say other issues aren't important, but it's not a rule of law country, and we are, and if we don't get that right, we have a range of very serious problems. I also agree that the indictments on the cyber side were a turning point. I think if you were going to use that model here, the Chinese are not going to extradite very freely because we don't want to extradite people back to the PRC freely for very good reasons. So the way I would use indictments in this case, and we could go a long time, I want to try to be quick, is if we think the problem, this is based on this hearing, it is not based on any knowledge I have, I'm not accusing anyone, but if we think the problem is located heavily in Guangzhou, through the port of Guangzhou, for example, indict a Chinese government official involved in the port of Guangzhou for negligence at least, criminal negligence. Not with the point that they're going to come to U.S. justice, but for the point of making that public, that is a way to pressure the Communist Party.
It does tell the story, and it does inhibit their travel.
Right.
So it really is something that they have to reckon with.
And they're very sensitive to that. Obviously, and I know you agree 100%. The indictments have to be very well grounded in fact. But if they are well grounded in fact, then indicting members of the Communist Party, Chinese government officials, does put pressure on the party to change.
Mr. Frunze, what should we be thinking of in Rhode Island for our post offices so that when packages come in, the proper scanning is done? How should we protect our folks? Is there equipment available that you could put into either a local post office or a big branch post office to more effectively detect fentanyl?
Thank you for the question. We have worked with the post office in the past, especially after the white powder scares, to identify unknown white powders in postal facilities and other places as well. They are customers. They've sent their data to me. I've seen some of the things that they've seen. In my opinion, the best way to protect both postage and consigned packages is to go to the large international sorting facilities. So Memphis, and I think Lexington for UPS and FedEx, and the larger ones for our postal service, implementing, because this technology to see through packages, they want what they call a tunnel of truth. You shoot the packages through the tunnel and you see what's inside. So those would be very large installations. So you want to put a large installation where lots and lots of packages are to get maximal effect. So I would recommend, we're trying to implement our X-ray and CT and other technologies that we look for explosives on aircraft with to search for illicit pharmaceuticals, and we would put them in the larger installations that see the most action.
If I might ask one factual question, I don't want to overburden with time, but Mr. Nice might know this. I'm told that when the Chechen terrorists attacked and seized hostages in a Russian theater and the Russian security forces came to try to remedy that hostage incident. They used some form of aerosolized fentanyl to knock everybody out so that they could then go in and take out the terrorists and rescue the audience and the hostages. As it turned out, a lot of people were killed, but it strikes me that it's a pretty significant fact to know about how dangerous this damn stuff can be if it's being used as a weapon by the Russian government to resolve a hostage situation. Do you know, Mr. Nice, if that is factual?
I can't comment on whether or not that was factually the case. I have seen an interview before.
You can't comment, or you don't know?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
We may have questions for answer in writing, but we don't have any more orally. So we thank you for participation, and particularly, Mr. Nice, I'm told you had to make a trip from Europe to be here with us. We thank you for going that extra mile. I mean, extra thousands of miles to be here with us. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much.